Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow Armchair Historians. This episode marks the beginning of Armchair Historians' Halloween season. I know it's only September, but that's how much I love Halloween. So from now until the end of October, I will be interviewing people talking about their favorite spooky history. I'm talking seances in the White House, vampire scares in New England, and one of Canada's most infamous massacres of a family and the subsequent haunting of the town in which that family lived. Don't worry. For all of my straight history fans, there's going to be plenty of history. So buckle up, everybody, and enjoy the ride. Before we begin, I'd like to give a big shout out to our Patreon and Ko-fi supporters. So a big heartfelt thank you goes out to Ruth Rosenfeld, Beverly Nix, Tremors 08, Paul Boat, Scott Greenberg, Edward Graham, and David Carroll. Your support means the world to us. If you would like to support the show, you can find links on our website for both Patreon and Ko-fi. In this episode of Armchair Historians, I chat with Ethan Healey about Mary Todd Lincoln and her desire to connect with the spirits of her loved ones, including 2 children who died in childhood, through seances and spiritualism. Ethan is finishing up his BA in History at New England College in Henniker, New Hampshire. His thesis is on John Adams during retirement and how Adams views the legacy he left behind. Ethan's work has been featured in the Henniker Review, a local college publication. He is currently in the process of graduate school applications and hopes to be studying for a Ph.D. in history next fall. Ethan Healey, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I'm super excited about the upcoming Halloween season, and this is going to be the first interview that I do that's going to be part of that historical history for Halloween. So why don't you tell me about your favorite history that you're going to be talking about today?
When you asked that question, when we were talking in pre-production, I really thought about this for quite a bit, and I was like, what is my favorite history? And I kind of have 2 answers to this question. I have a fun one and a serious one. The fun one is that a lot of my favorite history is typically within the early America age, and really finding out a lot about the early American Republic and trying to figure out why were those men, and a lot of times women, why were those people so fascinated with creating a new republic? And I love the early politics and the ruthlessness of the early republic. But my more serious answer is really my favorite kind of history is the one where we're always asking questions and we're constantly digging into the whys of history. I'm very fascinated with the whys of history and the whys and the hows. That's really what a lot of history is really just continuously asking the questions, why did this happen? How did this happen? And so much so that it has turned into dissertations. And at the end of the day, we're all history geeks and history buffs and all that stuff. And we're all just trying to learn about the whys of history. So For what I'm going to talk about today, I stumbled upon this quite a few years ago. I've always been very fascinated with Abraham Lincoln. I think a lot of people are. He's still a major political icon. I stumbled upon this not because of Halloween or anything like that maybe some of your viewers are doing now for your lovely addition to the historical community. I stumbled upon this a few years ago in one of the classes I was taking, and I was fascinated by it. And of course, I had to learn more. And going back to like my serious answer to why was she having seances in the White House, and why was she so fascinated with spiritualism? A lot of these questions, leads to Google searches, and Google searches leads to deep research, and you go into that rabbit hole.
So when you say she, for my listeners, who are we talking about?
Mary Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln.
Okay.
This would be Abraham Lincoln's wife.
Now, did she have the seances prior to her husband's death?
She did. It started for her after her second son, Willie Lincoln, died. And he died of typhoid fever in the second year of Abraham Lincoln's presidential administration. His death, more so than any others, really affected her. They had another son named Edward Lincoln who also passed away. But this one really affected her because it was in the middle of, again, a presidential administration. Well, not quite the middle of the Civil War, but we're in the middle of a war. And on top of this, her son has now passed away. So she really got deep into the idea of spiritualism. She was always a very spiritual person, but she really deep dived into that after her son Willie died of typhoid fever, which was very common in that day. So she really deep dived into that, and she started holding seances in the White House. Well, actually, she started doing it as she found a local group near Washington, D.C., and it's kind of interesting to imagine a first lady walking around Washington, D.C. That's completely unheard of now, by herself. But she found a local group. She really fit in, and she really started liking it, that she started holding her own seances at the White House, and she really fell into it.
I feel like Mary Lincoln is one of the most misunderstood historical characters. Can you just tell us a little bit about your perception of her personality, and maybe why she has been so misunderstood?
Yeah, whenever I hear about Mary Lincoln, you always hear the fact that she was crazy, or she had a lot of mental illnesses, and including her husband, Abraham Lincoln, saying that she had a lot of difficulties. And I think a lot of it is trauma and tragedy in her life. I cannot fathom the idea of not only losing a single child, but losing another. And then eventually she loses a third after Abraham Lincoln dies about 10 years after that. But yeah, and also her husband. So she just has all of these tragedies. And I think a lot of it, especially in the age where we're really talking about mental health as a really big issue and a really big epidemic, so to speak, where people are really talking openly about their mental health. They weren't. Mental health was never a big discussion, and there's been, even speculation about, well, it's kind of been proven now that Abraham Lincoln had severe depression, and she did too. And I think the reason why she's so misunderstood is because it's so easy to label someone with a mental illness, specifically a woman with a mental illness. It's so very easy to say, for that time, well, she was just crazy.
I'm trying to think of some of the indicators, some example of, well, this is indicative of her, mental health issue. What behavior, what thing did she do that was so, away from the norm?
I think she was a very vocal woman. She was a woman who is someone who was not afraid to talk about her husband's political aspirations. She was not a woman that we would think of in the traditional sense in the 19th century of, although there were difficulties that they had in their marriage, she really stuck up for her husband, and she of course loved her husband. She was not afraid to stick up for him. She hosted a lot of parties at the White House. Within hosting parties and stuff, she would simply introduce herself, and she would intrude, and these senators would come up to her, and she would talk down to them and say, how could you do this to my husband? How could you vote no on that bill? She was very educated, very politically educated as well. And, it's very similar to someone like, Abigail Adams, who was, the wife of John Adams, who was someone who was also very politically inclined and always put her opinion, although she more so did it to just her husband. Mary Lincoln was more so someone who just did it. She said, I'm going to speak about the bills he's trying to pass, about the difficulties he's having, about she was very open about all that, and she was very educated. And a lot of times, educated women at this time were seen as just taboo, I suppose. It's a really awful word to say, but it's the truth. When speaking in the terms of women in that day, people, and the funny thing is some people, really took her seriously, but others, were kind of telling Lincoln, like, you need to calm your wife down. She needs to,
Yeah, you need to reel her in, dude.
Yeah, exactly. And Lincoln kind of responds like, I can't control her.
I was just going to say that's kind of what always my perception has been, is that she was vocal, and that was unprecedented in that time. And men were supposed to be in control of their women and their wives and all that type of thing. And so
yes.
She reminds me of my mother. She was just one of those people who would just say what she thought.
Exactly.
That's something that has been done for ages, is that, oh, she's just crazy. And, I'm sure she did struggle with mental health issues, but at the same time, today she would probably be somebody to look up to and that type of thing. But thank you. That was a very good drawing of her personality. And getting back to the spiritualism and the seances, now that we kind of have that idea of who she was, I mean, how did she get in touch with these people? And how did her husband view her use of spiritualism and seances? Was he at the seances?
It's speculated that he was at a few. There are even some pictures, not photographs, but paintings and drawings of him at some of these. There's, a lot of speculation. He was there, but then the rumors were disproven. Some people saw that it was a political point, that making these drawings of Abraham Lincoln in this spiritual sense, doing a seance for his son, but also doing it for the soldiers that were dying in the American Civil War. But also, it was a political move to show him in an ordinary state, someone who is grieving, someone who is trying to process all of this. And it's worth noting, really, that spiritualism was not new at the American Civil War. Spiritualism has been there's a very long history of spiritualism. The American Civil War completely changed the way that we thought about death, and by we, I mean Americans, and it completely changed the game, so to speak, on how people process death, how people grieved about death. Because for a long time, especially in the 17th century with the Salem witch trials and stuff, talking about witchcraft and seances and all these things. The point is that spiritualism has always been around, and the Civil War completely changed the way we rethought about spiritualism and how to react. And to go to your question on how she found these people, it was really a connection thing, kind of he said, she said type thing, where she knew, I don't know the exact person, but she knew another woman, and that woman practiced spiritualism and seances.
So spiritualism, how would you define that?
I would define it as somebody who is trying to get in touch with other spirits who have passed on. You could define it in many other ways. You could, also say you're in touch with yourself. It's really the definition of spiritualism has completely changed within, the last few decades of especially, not espiritually, especially. And it's completely is completely changed. But in her day, I think spiritualism really meant that she was practicing getting in touch with the dead and practicing getting in touch with, in that sense, herself. How was she grieving about the death of her son or the death of Abraham Lincoln? And she really grieved very, very differently with the death of her son and the death of Lincoln in many ways.
So was spiritualism necessarily have a Christian component to it?
That's a very good question. And the only thing I would say about that is there's definitely a connection there. I don't think you could have a spiritualistic component without connecting it somehow to Christianity. The religion of Abraham Lincoln and the Lincolns is heavily debated. Some people say that Abraham Lincoln is an atheist, but other people say that Lincoln practiced Christianity. Others say that he didn't. There's no evidence of him committing to Christianity or anything like that. But more so for Mary Lincoln, I think it was rather than a religious component, and I guess it is a sort of a branch off of religion, rather than it being a religious component. For her, I think it was really a deep sense of just trying to get in touch with herself and how she was learning how to grieve.
So do you have any specific descriptions of one particular seance that she was involved in and what happened? And then kind of the other question I have is, do you think that it was shysterism on the part of the people who were doing the seances?
As far as a story, there is a story of after Willie Lincoln passed away, she was obviously very depressed and really not in the correct mindset, so much so that people had to hide knives away, and she became very suicidal. And she became very suicidal after the death of Abraham Lincoln as well. More on that later. So there is a story where she held a seance and she came to Abraham Lincoln. It's either Abraham Lincoln or one of her secretaries, and told them, I see him. I see Willie. And she says something to the effect, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but something to the effect of, I feel so much more comforted knowing that he's here with me. He's next to me, and he's really trying his best to come back to me. These type of things that mothers would feel.
Sure.
These type of things that mothers would want. So knowing that and knowing that story, she definitely felt a major sense of comfort from this, and a major sense of, to her, this worked, and to her this was a major step in the right direction for trying to connect with her son again.
So do you think that the people who she went to do these seances, do you think that they were the real deal, or that they definitely believed in what they were doing? Do you think there was any, shysterism involved in any of it?
There definitely was some of that. To kind of comment on the picture that you had tweeted out, for your viewers who don't know, there's this picture of Mary Todd Lincoln sitting down on a chair, and there's this ghost of Abraham Lincoln right behind her. And it's a really somber photo. You can see the look in her eyes is really dark. It's kind of like you can look in her eyes and know that, that woman's going through a lot. The photographer who took that, and let me see if I can come up with his name here. I don't know what his name is. William Mumler was his name. And he was a spiritualist photographer. And he was committed for fraud because he was creating these pictures that were seemingly everyone who went to him had a spirit come up behind them. And it was that exact spirit. It wasn't it was the spirit that they were looking for, so to speak. So in knowing that, she knew that going into this, that he was a fraud, and that his practice, so to speak, was illegitimate. But she still requested it, even though many people told her, I don't think it's a good idea. And by many people, her family, her sister, all these things, I don't think it's a good idea, but she wanted to do it. She really wanted to do it to connect with her husband. And she felt that, this is hyperbole, of course, but she felt in essence that if she went to this photographer and she could see it, then she could kind of believe it. And she was that type of person. And again, a large part of this is to comfort herself, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of Queen Victoria, because she did a lot of this same stuff from what I've heard and read. What else? What else about this do we need to know?
I think some of the things that we definitely need to know is the fact that there was probably a total of 8 seances that took place in the White House. It's also very well known that Abraham Lincoln is one of the most popular ghosts at the White House. His spirit is the most seen at the White House. There have been many people who have claimed to see Abraham Lincoln at the White House. Winston Churchill is one of those who saw Abraham Lincoln.
Who might have been drinking too much. And
exactly. That was probably it. That was probably it.
No, I'm not saying I don't believe in this stuff, because I kind of do. I mean, I get it. Like, I get Mary's jam there, because I know when I've lost people in my life, I've gone to, mediums and that type of thing. Like, I get it. I get why you do that, because it's so hard to deal with. I have a tour business here in Georgetown, the other Georgetown, Colorado, and I do ghost tours and history tours. I started out just doing history tours, but someone said, oh, you should do ghost tours. And so I've done one straight history tour all season, because the ghost tours are really popular. And I think it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of that same desire. And that's what I say during the tour. It's that thing. It's a big question we want to know the answer to. We want to talk about it. We want to think about it. We want to share our stories about it. So yeah, I get it. And I'm not saying like I don't believe there is something. I do believe there is something. And doing ghost tours has really kind of made me, there's a couple things that have happened that I just have no explanation for. Mm-hmm. And so yeah. What do you think about it?
I'm a ghost agnostic, whatever that means. It's never happened to me particularly. I've never seen a ghost or a spirit or anything like that. I've done the Ouija board stuff. A lot of it seems very voodoo-ish to me, but I definitely respect those who believe it. And that said, I'm still willing to believe it. Just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean that it's wrong, or it doesn't mean that, I'm wrong or anything.
Right.
But I'd like to believe that at the end of all this, we go to some place better than this. And, at the end of it, at the end of this, we go and we live a long and happier life, whatever that may mean. There's definitely something there. There's gotta be. It's kind of like I don't want to just give up the idea that it couldn't possibly happen.
I feel like most people who come on my tours, aside from the person who dragged them there, is the same way. That's a very good way to say it. They're ghost agnostics. That's going to be my new term. Are you a ghost agnostic? That's okay.
Exactly. They love it. They will respond to that and they'll go, yeah, that's exactly what I am. And this is a real obsession, especially in this day and age. People are obsessed with witchcraft and ghosts and, all these things. And it's really interesting hearing these people talk so passionately about it.
Yeah, I feel like some people believe anything. And I always say that I don't swallow everything whole.
Well, yeah, that too.
So what else about Mary and her seances, and maybe talk a little bit more about Abraham Lincoln and when he died? And you said that she grieved that death differently than she did her son.
She really fell into a much deeper depression because at this point, she's not just dealing with the emotional impact herself, but the whole country is dealing with this emotional impact. So she is currently experiencing trying to cope with the fact that she has lost her husband, but people lost their president. And
Sure.
now the tragedy and the depression sets in that it's a different kind of death. This is the first president to have been assassinated. People in the North especially are just completely distraught. So much so that the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, is someone who protects Mary Lincoln after this, and she only sees her husband's casket, I think, once or twice. Edwin Stanton takes her under her wing and says, "We need to protect you because the public criticism and the public outcry could get really nasty." So she was never at any public appearances or anything like that. Everything was always done in private, and because of this death of her husband, she escaped out of public life forever until her death. After this, she starts getting into spiritualism even more than she did during Willie Lincoln's death, because there's this period between 1863 to 1865 when Lincoln dies that she takes a break from it for whatever reason. I'm not too sure of the reason, but she takes a break from spiritualism and the seances. We could speculate that it's just, life happened and she moved on a little bit and started hosting parties again or whatever Mary Lincoln does. But after Abraham Lincoln dies, she gets back into it pretty heavy. And she starts really trying to understand the death of her husband, why this had to happen to her, why this had to happen to him. Especially Abraham Lincoln dying on Good Friday is always very significant for the religious people, because after this, Abraham Lincoln is seen as an angel. There are a ton of historical depictions of Abraham Lincoln seen going up to heaven and George Washington, open arms, all that stuff. And Abraham Lincoln is seen as an angel after this, mostly by people in the North, not the South. But yeah, Abraham Lincoln's there's this view of Lincoln as this angel, this martyr, and I personally can't imagine what that must do for a wife, someone who they were very close to, especially because they had plans to go on vacation after Abraham Lincoln gained a second term, and they had these plans to go on vacation and do things together and reconnect, because there was a major disconnect between 1861 and 1865 because there's a war going on. Lincoln doesn't have time to spend with his wife, so to speak. I mean, that's sad to say, but it's the truth. And really what starts happening is, as things go on, she starts, her oldest son, Robert Lincoln, who is probably the more well-known of the sons, he's the only living child at this point, and he's the oldest, and he's the only living child. All of her sons have died, except Robert. And Robert he considers her seances and her spiritualism as erratic behavior, is what he calls it. And he institutionalizes her, especially because she was talking about suicide, and she was talking about leaving the earth and all these really heavy, heavy things, because she didn't think she had much to live for, especially because not only did her husband die, but all of her children have died, except Robert. So Robert institutionalizes her, and eventually she does get out, and she goes to live with her sister for the rest of her days until she dies in the late 1800s from a stroke. She died in her 60s. And why I say she reacted much differently than Willie is just because of the mere circumstances and the complete distraught that she must have felt afterwards. I can't imagine.
Yeah, so much loss. A lot of loss. It does sound like maybe the spiritualism became an obsession, maybe an unhealthy obsession, obviously.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think, and this is the hard part. There's not much known about Mary Lincoln after the death of Abraham Lincoln, because there's not much. She doesn't write in diaries. She doesn't send much letters. She doesn't do much of any of that. So it's really, a lot of it is, just documents that historians can get from, the mental hospital she stayed at, or Robert Lincoln himself, because thankfully he ended up living many years after that. So
Interesting. I interviewed a woman, her ancestor, a woman named Elizabeth Dixon, was depicted in, I can't remember the artist's name that did the painting, but it's Lincoln's deathbed. And she was one of the women who Mary Todd Lincoln had called to comfort her during the final hours of Lincoln's life. And I'm telling you this because I know that you are getting your PhD. I think there's a lot of information to be had out there if you dig. And so she, one of the things she did to verify the fact that she was actually there was she went to a collection that one of her aunts had donated to one of the archives in Washington. There was a letter in there from Mary Lincoln that had gotten misfiled in the collection. And it's Mary Lincoln to Elizabeth Dixon. And she's saying that when they asked her if she wanted somebody to come there, she said, "Oh, I want Elizabeth Dixon." And this is in her own words. So, and this is pretty new information, but I do think that history is going to give us up secrets for years to come. And I think you're the kind of person that's is going to find that misfiled letter or whatever it is. So I think, it sounds like you dig and you go down the rabbit hole, and I admire that. I rely on other people to do that, so then they can come back and tell me what they found.
Yeah, no, that's a good strategy. It's a very good strategy.
I say my guests do the heavy lifting. I get to hear new stories.
You're in the good seat.
Yeah, I like what I'm doing. So what else? Is there anything else about this that I haven't asked you that you want to share?
I would just say for your viewers that, or listeners, I should say, that I don't know if you've ever seen the film Lincoln.
Yes.
Directed by Steven Spielberg. Yes. Absolutely brilliant film. And I think Mary Lincoln, that was portrayed by Sally Field, who is also brilliant, is probably the most accurate depiction we're ever going to get of Mary Lincoln. Okay. And if you ever rewatch that film, and I haven't rewatched it in quite a few years, so I should go back.
No, it's a long one. There was a lot of long films that year, I remember, for the
Academy
Awards. Yeah,
there was a lot of good ones. That was the same year as 12 Years a Slave, I believe, which was also brilliant. Yeah, many, many good movies. And the reason why I mention this is because Sally Fields did a year and a half of research before that movie was done, and I guess she pleaded with Steven Spielberg that she needs to play Mary Lincoln, and she of course did. And with someone like her, who never ages, but also someone like her who is really dedicated to her craft, it's very admirable, and it's a brilliant depiction of Mary Lincoln. It doesn't depict the spiritualism, unfortunately, but it does depict the way she grieved, the way she lived, the way she loved, the way it also depicts what we were talking about earlier about her kind of speaking up and, saying things to senators and representatives, and, saying her what she thought and how she wasn't afraid to say that. So
right.
Just for your listeners, thought it might be very useful to, if they're more deeper interested in Mary Lincoln, go watch.
Yeah, that was a great film. I love that. I'll link out to information about the film as well as moving on. Tell us about where we can find you and what you're doing. Maybe do you have an idea of what you're going to be studying for your PhD?
So, You can find me many places. You can find me on Twitter. That's usually where I spend most of my time, unfortunately. Twitter's a dirty place, but I love it nonetheless.
I'll tell you, I've gotten some of my best interviews from Twitter. I don't get it. Like how to use it as a marketing device. I don't think it is, but as far as communicating with people with similar interests, I think it's great.
Oh, definitely. I have met so many wonderful historians and so many wonderful people just through Twitter. So if I didn't have a Twitter account, I wouldn't be on this podcast. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate it.
But you can find me many places. I have a website, ethanhealey.home.blog. You can find me at my Twitter account, which is Ethan Healey. Very easy. And also, what I'm doing right now, my bachelor's degree thesis is not at all what has no relation to Abraham Lincoln, but is more so on John Adams and the second president, John Adams, more so during retirement and how he viewed his legacy and the legacy he left behind, and trying to put that into perspective. So I'm currently working on that right now. My Ph.D., what I really want to study in my life is I want to study early America, like I was saying a little bit earlier, the early republic, really from the period probably between, to make it clean, we'll say 1765 to 1865. Let's make it clean. So really that 100-year period that is just so fascinating to me politically, and there's still so much more to learn about early America, and there's still so much, especially in the day and age we're talking about, with brilliant things happening like the 1619 Project and so much more diversity in the historical community being talked about anyway. And I do recognize that I'm a straight white male within the historical community talking about early America, but I do think there's a significant importance to the idea of hopefully what I'll be able to offer, and what I'm able to offer, is my research and help and anything I can do. This is what I want to do as a career and what I want to do with my life. I'd love to teach. And so you're actually the very first time I've been on a podcast. So thanks for having me.
Oh, wow. So, of course, I'll link out to your website, to your blog, and your Twitter account. And maybe we could have you back on the show to talk about your PhD. No, not your PhD. That will be the third time you're on the show. But maybe we could have you on the show to talk about Adams and the research you
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That'll be done in May. So come to me during the summer and I'll be here.
I'll tap you on the shoulder. I'll make a note. Definitely. So is there anything else that you want to share about this history?
I guess my final thing I would say is that we're not done with Mary Lincoln. The research on Mary Lincoln still needs to be had. There are a few historians that are doing really good work on Mary Lincoln. And I believe there was a new book that just came out. The book is called An American Marriage, The Untold Story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd. And it's by a very well-known Lincoln scholar and historian, Michael Burlingame. And he's done brilliant work on Abraham Lincoln, including a 2-volume biography on Abraham Lincoln. So he knows this stuff pretty well. Really just to say that there's so much more to learn about Mary Lincoln, so much more to learn about history, and I urge your listeners that if they're interested in this stuff, that, just because it hasn't been written yet doesn't mean there's not some stuff there. So,
sure, yeah. So the woman that I interviewed was Caroline Welling Van Dusen, and her ancestor was Elizabeth Dixon, and that was an interesting episode if you ever decide to listen to it. It's got Absolutely. Some really interesting information in it. In contrast, going back to Mary Lincoln's kind of personality and that she said what she thought to whoever she wanted to say it to. Mm-hmm. In contrast, this woman, Elizabeth Dixon, there's a lot of diaries. And so her descendant, Caroline, is doing this research. And she actually, one of the diaries was published in, I want to say, the White House History magazine or something of that nature. She never really wrote about politics. Mm-hmm. That information wasn't in there. And yet, and this is another woman that I'm really fascinated with, Elizabeth Dixon, because the first place that she goes to when she goes on her honeymoon and travels to Europe is to the gravesite of a famous, and I can't think of her name, female abolitionist. So even though she didn't write about politics, those little breadcrumbs say a lot to me. That was the first place that she went to and what her, politics really were. But yeah, I think there's a lot of information for you historians to reveal for us lay people in the future. Anyways.
Thank you so much for having me. And you're doing some good work here with your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So continue the good work, and I hope to be on again.
Oh, absolutely. I really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about Mary Lincoln. There you have it. Ethan Healey talking about Mary Todd Lincoln, her Seances and Spiritualism. I just want to remind you that there are several ways that you can support the show, and all of the things I'm going to mention have a big impact. First of all, you can leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And second, subscribe, like, and follow us on social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, join in on the conversation by leaving comments. You can also buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi or become a patron through Patreon. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.